All right, so I've taken my map of Oz and I've now to the point that I've taken these hill graphics and I have changed them over mimicking height map hills. They're looking a lot better, but there is definitely some uniformity in them. And I think that's one thing that we can address. And we can do that by tweaking some of the settings on the clone tool. So let's just kind of zoom in a little bit and maybe we'll move into this area where we've got these hills that are sort of adjacent to mountain areas. So I'm going to use the cloning tool and just quickly discussing a few options. Generally speaking, of course, I will you hold the control button down and click, and then if you click in another area and hold the mouse button down, it will copy what you move over. And this is really great. It's good for general patterns, repetition, and so forth. Downsides is sometimes the pattern can be overly obvious or overly repetitive. So we can play around with some of the settings. First of all, in addition to the basics, as far as being able to adjust the brush size or the force or the hardness of the edge or so forth, we can also take a look at some of the options down here. One that's rather nice is this apply jitter. And if you check that box, let's move it up a bunch. And if I do the same thing, and if you watch the source circle, you'll see that it's now jumping around all over the place, creating a higher degree of randomness in what we're doing. So that's a nice way to be able to really, really randomize things. In addition to that, of course, there's a smooth stroke. And with both of these, you can adjust the strength. With all these, you can adjust how much of the jitter you want or how much you want that stroke smoothed out. But now if we start to do something like this, we're still getting some of that jumping around and some of that jitter effect, but it sort of creates a little bit more variation in what's happening. The other thing to take into account is that the brush type. And if we go ahead and pick one of these other brush types, like maybe that I think that's the cell one. Yes, one of the cell options. Where that's really big. Well, I'll leave it big for the moment. But we can get more of that type of an effect happening. Now that's pretty crazy and extreme, and I don't know if that's the one I actually want to use. Maybe a bristle, and maybe we'll shrink that down a little bit. But now if I start to mimic let's go a little bigger, huh? But now I can get some additional texture in what we're doing as well, and that might end up being rather useful, depending on what type of effects you're trying to do. And here's the other thing. Of course, if I do the big sweep across, it just ends up being less textured. But if I'm a little more just click and move around ish or take smaller strokes, I can get slightly different effects. So the main takeaway here is that there are a number of options. Check those boxes, play around with the settings. If you end up not liking the results, we always have Control Z. You can always undo. And very often, if you go off and do something else, whatever it might be, and then we come back to the clone tool, a lot of those settings will reset themselves by default and go back to their default values. So just something to keep in mind. I'm going to go ahead and do some of that myself through some of these areas just to kind of get those hills just a little bit more, just to take them a step further. And then we probably will move on to playing around with the mountains.